In 3.5 years, the veterans of the Confederate Army of Tennessee have marched and fought their way across most of the Middle South. They've won battles, despite consistently poor leadership. They've seen their land and economy destroyed, their Confederacy shrink with Union invasion, and their army decimated with senseless slaughter. Over the past month and a half, 20,000 of their comrades have been killed or wounded. But they now have a chance before them, a chance to strike a final blow and possibly salvage their doomed Confederacy. It's November 20th, 1864. They're on the march, north. The desperate campaign into Tennessee has begun. It will be their last. By the fall of 1864, the Northern Army's death grip on the Confederacy was near final. General Grant's Army of the Potomac knocked at Richmond's doorstep. Phil Sheridan's blue soldiers were beginning their systematic destruction of the South's breadbasket, Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Confederate raids in the Trans-Mississippi had ended in failure, and Sherman was well on his way to infamy, marching through Georgia. So far, hundreds of thousands of men were now dead or lame. America had changed dramatically since 1861. Northern industry reached its adolescence supporting the war effort. With its shores blockaded by Federal ships, Southern industry did all it could, but what the South desperately lacked was one of the North's greatest assets. This asset was manpower. Dead, wounded, or captured Northern boys were replaced. The South, though, could never adequately fill its vacant ranks. With death around every hillside, a wave of religious revivalism spread through the Confederate Army. In 1864, soldiers looked to God for answers. The war had changed everything, even warfare itself. No longer were men fighting for possession of cities or hills. Now they fought to chew up opposing armies. For 40 days last spring in Virginia, Grant and Lee had nearly done just that. Grant's Army of the Potomac alone lost 54,000 before digging in at Petersburg. The Civil War had grown old.
9/10 of all Americans were anxious for peace. Peace on almost any terms, and utterly sick of human slaughter and devastation. Horace Greeley.
All that has gone on before is mere skirmishing. U.S. Grant.
These incredible casualties were brought about in a large part by the rifle musket, highly accurate at long ranges. Northern ingenuity invented metallic cartridges and repeating rifles, and a dawn of freedom instituted a new recruit into the Union Army. Each of these developments would play themselves out in the upcoming campaign in Tennessee. His family had disowned him. Even his picture hangs backwards on their wall. Now George Thomas commands one of the largest Northern armies in the field. This native Virginian stance to stay with the Union labeled him a traitor throughout the South. But his loyalty to the North is firm. He's never lost a battle. In fact, just a year ago in northern Georgia, his division had saved the entire Union Army. Thomas became known as the Rock of Chickamauga. His soldiers adore him. They call him Old Pap. In early October, Thomas is in Nashville with 2 divisions to protect the city from harassing raids from the famous Confederate cavalry leader Nathan Bedford Forrest. Thomas is also there to protect Nashville and destroy Hood's army as Sherman begins his march through Georgia. Thomas takes his time preparing defenses and gathering troops from across the West. Nothing will occur until Pap Thomas is ready for it. U.S. Grant thinks Thomas's cautious fighting style slow beyond excuse. Sherman, Thomas's direct superior, thinks him slow but true as steel. In Tennessee, this methodical slowness would almost cost Thomas his job. The Civil War made John Bell Hood. In Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Hood had prospered with quick promotions and an excellent battle record. In fact, his bold fighting style borders on reckless stupidity. At Antietam, Maryland, 2 years ago, he'd used up nearly 2/3 of his division to help save Lee's army. He likes his troops to assault head-on with the cold steel of the bayonet, if necessary. Back in July, the 33-year-old was placed in command of the Army of Tennessee. Since then, defending Atlanta, 20,000 men in his army have been killed or wounded. Atlanta burned anyway. This is the first time Hood has ever been in charge of an entire army. One of his division commanders comments that Hood had gone up like a rocket. It's to be hoped that he will not come down like a stick. In fact, the Army of Tennessee had never had a commander they especially liked, except for the ever-cautious Joe Johnston, the man Hood replaced, and whose defensive fighting style suited the Army of Tennessee. The veterans know Hood's fighting record. He isn't trusted amongst the ranks. They mourn his coming.
It was the most terrible and disastrous blow that the South ever received. I saw thousands of grown men cry like babies. Sam Watkins.
Hood has a problem with the Army of Tennessee as well. He thinks they don't like to assault breastworks. Also, the Confederate government in Richmond expects big things from John Bell Hood. The loss of Atlanta was a huge stumbling block. Now, Hood's army, after decimating Sherman's railroad system, is in northern Alabama. The question remains whether John Bell Hood can physically produce results. The battle at Gettysburg mangled Hood's left arm. After Chickamauga, his leg was amputated at the hip. In the field, Hood must be strapped into his saddle. For his constant pain, he takes laudanum, a highly addictive form of opium. Recently, he was engaged to the belle of Richmond, Sally Buck Preston. She calls him Sam.
Things are so bad out there. They cannot be worse. You know, they have saved Johnston from the responsibility of his own blunders and put Sam in. Poor Sam. Sally Preston.
Hood and Thomas both have something to prove. Both men need victory to sustain their careers. They don't have long to wait. Very soon, much more than their military careers will be decided in Middle Tennessee. Hood's 34,000 entered the state of Tennessee on November 22, 1864. Nearly half of his army had finally stepped foot again in their home state. 25 regiments hailed from Tennessee. When the campaign ends, the enormous amount of Tennessee casualties will put the entire state into mourning. Hood's goal is to place his army directly between Thomas's forces in Nashville and 2 Federal corps, currently in Pulaski, Tennessee. He then hopes to destroy each section of the Union Army before they can coordinate together. He marches for Columbia. 33-year-old Federal Commander John Schofield is worried. He knows Sam Hood very well. In fact, in the early 1850s, he tutored Hood in math back at West Point. Schofield also knows that he's facing a very deadly adversary. Schofield's Union command of 25,000 are outnumbered. He must connect with Thomas in Nashville to defeat Hood's army. But Thomas also needs time to coordinate and organize the Nashville defenses. Schofield must buy him some days. By November 29th, Hood is bearing down on Spring Hill. He's left 1/3 of his army back at Columbia to hold Schofield in place. The larger portion will block the Federal retreat. Between these Confederate jaws, Schofield's troops risk annihilation. By 3 p.m., Schofield has just one lone division. Roughly 5,500 troops under David Stanley in Spring Hill to face Hood's 34,000. Everything points to a huge Confederate victory. But then the situation gets strange. Hood sends his best corps under Ben Cheatham to attack Spring Hill. When the attacks begin, Hood goes back to the cozy confines of his headquarters, where he treats an earlier fall from his horse with doses of laudanum, letting his subordinates work out the fine details. He shouldn't have. Things quickly get confusing.
I distinctly heard the unmistakable whack and knew that some of our boys was hit. They came with a rush and a yell and swept like a cyclone across that field. It was now safer in the rear, and the order came not a whit too soon. Fall back. William Kesey, 64th Ohio.
A Confederate division had pierced the Federal right flank. Panic was spreading retreat through the blue ranks. But Cheatham amazingly halts the Confederate attack. He has no idea of the Federal strength in Spring Hill and wants to have his corps intact, but he seems to have misplaced one of his 3 divisions. Earlier, before leaving the battlefield, Hood had personally positioned Cheatham's missing division along the Columbia-Franklin Pike. His orders for them were to attack Spring Hill from this direction and cut off the Federal columns from reinforcing Stanley in Spring Hill. Possession of the Columbia-Franklin Pike is imperative for Hood's strategy of trapping the Federal army. Long blue columns were strung out on the pike. Cheatham's missing division was within 100 yards of smashing into the Federals, but Cheatham's courier finds them first, with orders to join in the attack, which has now been delayed for an hour. Consequently, the division marches away from the pike. The door to the Federal retreat was left open, never again to be closed. Cheatham's renewed attack at Spring Hill never fully gets off the ground, and all night long, with sleeping Confederates just yards away, 20,000 Federals march literally unnoticed past disaster and continue their retreat to Franklin. One of the best opportunities for total destruction of an army has been lost. It's the last opportunity John Bell Hood will ever have. The morning of November 30th, Hood realizes that Schofield's Federal army has escaped. Headquartered in the Spring Hill mansion of Nathaniel Cheers, Hood met with many of his generals for the last time. He was described as being as mad as a rattlesnake.
The best move in my career as a soldier had come to naught. The discovery that the Army, after a forced march of 180 miles, was still seemingly unwilling to accept battle unless under the protection of breastworks, caused me to experience grave concern. In my innermost heart, I questioned whether or not I would ever succeed in eradicating this evil. John Bell Hood.
Later that afternoon, Hood would instead eradicate something else: most of his army. The large casualties during the Civil War can be indirectly blamed upon one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. His victorious French military campaigns were heavily studied and copied by officers on both sides. Napoleonic strategy based itself upon one main principle: a concentrated field of fire, which was produced by elbow-to-elbow tight formations. This tactic was developed for the smoothbore or non-rifled musket, which must be massed in a concentrated field of fire to be accurate. The problem in using these tactics during the Civil War was that by 1864, most soldiers carried rifle muskets, highly accurate at long ranges. Atrocious casualty rates brought about rifle pits and breastworks. The mass assault was a dying strategy, but one that unfortunately would be applied time and time again throughout the Civil War. At Franklin, Tennessee, a mass assault of the worst kind would wield its ugly head. The result would be some of the most needless bloodshed of the entire war. The repeating rifle, the envy of a Union soldier, or the fortunate Confederate who could pick one from a battlefield. Its lever action drove home one bullet after another without pulling a ramrod or biting a cartridge. Up to 15 bullets could be fired in 30 seconds. The standard had been 2 to 3 muzzle-loading shots per minute. At Franklin and at Nashville, repeating rifles would allow Federal units to hold off 3 times their number with deadly effectiveness. By first light November 30th, all 3 corps of Hood's Army of Tennessee were fast on the heels of Schofield's lucky Federal Army. The Butternut veterans were furious at the missed opportunity to defeat the Federal Army at Spring Hill.
The bird had flown. Sam Watkins.
Hood's best was in front of the Army of Tennessee, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Throughout the war, the legendary Cavalier put fear into every Federal commander he faced. This morning, his troopers have been harassing the rear guard elements of Schofield's army. Most of the Federal Army is at Franklin. The site outside the town halts Forrest's pursuit. Nearly 2 miles of strong breastworks bristle with blue uniforms. It seems Schofield has decided to fight after all. Schofield has been in the saddle all night. He's beginning to panic. High water has the Harpeth River impassable. His cavalry are nowhere to be found. And to make matters worse, George Thomas up in Nashville wants him to hold Hood's army at Franklin for 3 days. Schofield's not sure he can hold Hood for 3 hours. Yet in just a bit more time than that, his soldiers have built some of the toughest fortifications ever constructed on a battlefield. Earlier that morning, Schofield ordered Division Commander Jacob Cox to oversee construction of the Union defenses. Cox anchors the Federal line along a cotton farm owned by Fountain Branch Carter, a local with sons in the Confederate Army. In a few hours, his farm will become etched in history as the site of some of the worst killing of the Civil War. One of his sons, Todd Carter, is now with Hood's approaching columns. Todd Carter will die later this evening in his own bed. The open fields in front of the Federal breastworks provide a clear field of fire for 1.5 miles. Each flank is safely anchored by the Harpeth River. 2 full Federal corps, 25,000 men, fill the breastworks. The large cannon on Fort Granger across the Harpeth River can sweep the Confederate lines. Schofield is confident that even Hood won't be so foolish to attack such strong defenses. Many of these Federal soldiers were at the start or end of their Army enlistments. Intermingled amidst the veterans were recruits, fresh from the western farms and towns. Some of these men received their rifles just 10 days ago. They hadn't been in the Army yet 30 days. They would replace the veteran regiments whose 3-year enlistments would expire this month. Today would be a quick and deadly lesson in soldiering. That morning, Hood decides to teach his army a lesson. While his troops file into fields on both sides of the Columbia Pike, he inspects the Federal works. They don't scare him. His army will attack the breastworks at Franklin. The attack will be in the open with bayonet if necessary, and they will drive the Federals into the Harpeth River or die trying. Hood's subordinates propose other plans. Forrest wants to flank Schofield, but the general will not be swayed. Schofield must not link with Thomas.
I would prefer to fight them here, where they have only 8 hours to fortify, than to strike them at Nashville, where they have been strengthening themselves for 3 years or more. John Bell Hood.
Posted nearly a half-mile in front of the Federal breastworks are 2 brigades. They've been Schofield's rear guard element, fighting Forrest all morning. They're exhausted, but desperately digging their own simple breastworks. Some men have scratched their names on the backs of their belt buckles, so they can be identified when killed. George Wagner, their division commander, has been drinking all morning. Wagner is safely within the main line of breastworks. He's ordered them to remain within this exposed position and withstand the Confederate onslaught everyone can plainly see forming. Hood's attack plan is simple. 2 full corps stretching 3 miles wide will march across open fields and hit the Federal works. Cheatham's corps will advance on the left flank, straddling the Columbia Pike. A.P. Stewart's corps will attack with the Harpeth River as their right guide. This attack will be larger than that of George Pickett at Gettysburg, and almost as ineffective. At 4 p.m. on November 30th, 1864, 20,000 Confederate soldiers, 6 divisions of the Army of Tennessee, begin their mile-and-a-half march toward the Federal works. It would be their last attack of the war.
The afternoon sun, like a ball of fire, setting in all its southern splendor in a molten sea of bronze over the distant hills. In the hazy golden light, and with their yellowish-brown uniforms, those in front seemed to be magnified in size. One could almost imagine them to be phantoms sweeping along in the air.
A profound silence pervaded the entire army. It was simply awful, reminding one of those sickening lulls which precede a tremendous thunderstorm.
The regiments are in view, stretching through and across the fields as far as the eye can see. Far to the south, now and then faintly a wail, the eerie, jubilant rebel yell. The air is hazy, and I can hear bands playing. Adam Weaver.
This was the only battle where the tooters and shooters went in together.
As expected, Wagner's 4,000 men are horribly overlapped. They quickly break and run in the face of the Confederate mass. Many are captured. The retreating soldiers block the field of fire for the Union men within the breastworks. Some men in the breastworks join Wagner's men in the panic. Then suddenly, a Federal volley erupts. Without orders, some 20,000 Federals begin to open fire at the oncoming mass. The slaughter begins.
The long line of blue coats rose, and a flash of flame shot out in a sinuous line, and the white smoke rose like the foam on the crest of a breaker. The few straggling bluecoats and the long line of gray went down like overripe grain before a blast of wind and hail. Bill Kesey, 64th Ohio.
They were coming on a run, emitting the shrill rebel charging yell, and so close that my first impulse was to drop flat on the ground and let them charge over. Captain John Schellenberger, Wagner's division.
The Missourians advanced bent over, with their hats pulled down over their eyes, as though for protection from a hailstorm. Old hell was let loose and coming out there.
The Confederates will hit the Federal works at Franklin with 13 separate charges. The Federals' outermost line of defense is overtaken. In places, all that separates the opposing lines is a mound of dirt. 2 Confederate divisions penetrate a gap near the Carter family garden. Here, crammed amidst just a few acres of land, thousands upon thousands of men will be killed or wounded. The Union Army is on the verge of retreat, but one lone blue brigade is about to save Schofield's entire army. Earlier that morning, Emerson Updike refused to obey his division commander, George Wagner. Wagner wanted Updike's men out with the other 2 exposed brigades. Risking court-martial, Updike instead takes his brigade into the main Federal lines. His gamble will pay off. His brigade is now in reserve behind the Carter house. To stop the panic, he orders a regiment to form a line across the Columbia Pike. Other Federal officers, amidst the confusion, assume an advance has been ordered. Miraculously, a counterattack builds. Many veterans morbidly mentioned after the war that over the noise of battle, they distinctly heard bullets snapping human bones. Patrick Clayburn was something of a folk hero in the South. The Irish immigrant had a flourishing law practice in Helena, Arkansas before the war. In 1861, he joined the Confederate Army as a private. 3 years later, he now commands the best division in Hood's army. He was recently engaged.
If this cause, which is so dear to my heart, is doomed to fail, I pray heaven may let me fall with it. Patrick Clayburn.
Clayburn is killed, leading his division at Franklin. 14 of his brigade and regimental commanders are killed, wounded, or missing. Hood's gamble started off well. He'd penetrated the Federal lines and caused thousands of Federals to run with hysteria. But now his men are stuck. To fall back or advance is suicidal. Confederates are sardined within the open breastworks. Blood begins to puddle in the trenches. Their advanced position allows Federals to shoot down the sides of the trenches from both flanks. Most Confederate field officers are dead or wounded. For all practical purposes, Schofield has won. In 5 hours of fighting, 7,000 Confederates are either killed, wounded, or missing. 6 Confederate generals are dead or dying. 4 are seriously wounded, and 1 has been captured.
There were 44 hospitals in town, 3 for Federal wounded and the rest for the Confederates.
It can't be called anything else but cold-blooded murder. Captain Sam Foster, Clayburn's division.
That night, in the midst of darkness, Hood attempts yet another assault. He even plans to attack again the next morning. Thankfully, Schofield continues his retreat. By midnight, his entire army is pulled out of the trenches and are on the road to join Thomas in Nashville. The next morning, as General Hood inspects the littered battlefield at Franklin, he weeps. As the battle raged to the south, Thomas's reinforcements at Nashville were gathering. On November 30th, A.J. Smith's 16th Corps finally arrived in Nashville. Smith's boys had traveled over 1,000 miles in the past month, and they were a rough-looking set, a bold statement within the Western Federal Army. They boasted they'd been to Vicksburg, Red River, and Missouri. If old A.J. orders us to, we'll go to hell itself. Smith's 15,000 are hard fighters and a desperately needed element to the Nashville defense. When Smith reports to Thomas, old Pap hugs him. Smith's men will be the primary assault troops at Nashville. Also currently within the works are James Steedman's Corps, 7,500 strong. One brigade is filled with the Army's lowest form. invalids, deserters, conscripts, and bounty jumpers. The two other brigades are United States colored units, many recently freed from slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 ended slavery and opened the door to enlistment of African Americans into the Federal Army. Freemen and former slaves alike flocked to become a soldier. Initially, most were placed in non-combatant roles. Consequently, few had seen action. Those that had knew the heightened risks they'd face over their white counterparts. Some Confederate commanders issued no quarter to captured or surrendered black soldiers and their white officers. At the end of the war, African Americans would make up nearly 1/3 of the Federal Army. Nashville would be their proving ground. With Schofield's exhausted Franklin veterans now in Nashville, Thomas is nearly ready. He has 75,000 troops to face Hood's 25,000. Thomas, in mid-December, will attack Hood with an army 3 times that of Schofield's Federals at Franklin. The stage for Hood's final coup de grace is almost set.
Near Franklin, December 1st, 1864. The commanding general congratulates the Army upon the success achieved yesterday over our enemy by their heroic and determined courage. The enemy has been sent in disorder and confusion to Nashville, and while we lament the fall of many gallant officers and brave men, we have shown to our countrymen that we can carry any position occupied by the enemy. John Bell Hood.
Our army was a wreck. I can safely say that just 2 such victories will wipe out any army the power of man can organize.
Morale within the Army of Tennessee is at an all-time low. Yet Hood remains on the offensive. He hopes to keep his army the invader. But the ever-offensive commander will reconstruct his strategy. Hood will go on the defensive and attempt to draw Thomas out of his formidable breastworks. The roles have been reversed. Hood approaches Nashville in early December. He immediately builds 4 miles of breastworks of his own, placing the city under siege. For nearly 2.5 weeks, both armies sit there. The Federals in the trenches grow impatient and expect an attack from Hood hourly. Bad weather and the remounting of 12,000 cavalrymen keep Thomas from attacking, despite veiled threats of his removal from Washington. Northern newspapers report that Thomas is penned up at Nashville and that Hood's massive army is set to invade Chicago and Cleveland. But Hood's ragged army is hungry, in tatters and very cold. 3,500 are without shoes. In early December, the Nashville area is hit with a huge winter storm. Veterans on both sides suffer some of the worst winter weather of the war.
If the rebels scoop us up here another fortnight, there won't be a tree left within 5 miles of Nashville.
As the waiting game continues, Hood splits his command, sending Nathan Bedford Forrest off toward Murfreesboro to cut off a garrison of Federals. It's a terrible move. These 8,500 Yankees will keep Forrest out of the battle for Nashville. It's a decision Hood will regret for the rest of his life. George Thomas' job is on the line. Recently, he'd received a telegram from Grant, "Attack Hood at once and wait no longer. There is great danger of delay, resulting in a campaign back to the Ohio River." Union Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wires Grant, "Gabriel will be blowing his horn before George H. Thomas ever moves." Threats of Thomas' removal ring the telegraph. But finally, by December 9th, Thomas is ready. Then, the sleet and snow set in. For 5 days, the weather renders military movement impossible. On December 14th, it clears. Thomas checks out of his Nashville hotel, pays his bill, and begins to set his attack in motion. He will send Steedman to feint an attack on Hood's far right. Schofield and Wood's corps will hold the center with attacks. A.J. Smith's corps will turn Hood's left flank. Wilson's 12,000 newly mounted cavalry will get in Hood's left and rear. This is the same tactic Grant and Sherman have used successfully over the past few years. In fact, it's the same strategy that's been beating the Confederacy in the West, the turning of its left flank. December 15th, 1864. The Federals will attack today. A fog descends on the opposing lines. Hood's soldiers can't see 3 feet in front of their face. By mid-morning, the fog lifts. Federal artillery immediately rains shells upon the center of the Confederate line. Around noon, Wood's 13,500 go in. The Confederate position along Montgomery Hill is taken easily. Thomas had used an entire corps and an enormous amount of artillery to take a Confederate skirmish line. Hood had tightened his lines. Now he's on the Brentwood Hills, almost 2 miles south of his original position. Thomas's troops approached the main Confederate line and penetrated immediately. Stuart's Franklin decimated corps break and run. The fight was no longer within the Army of Tennessee. 100-man Federal companies easily capture 4 times their number. The low rebel morale was exposed.
The men seemed utterly lethargic and without interest in battle. I never witnessed such want of enthusiasm and began to fear for tomorrow, hoping that General Hood would retreat during the night.
It was a full stampede.
Early winter darkness saves Hood's army that day, not before losing 16 pieces of artillery and between 800 to 1,000 men. Hood hadn't given up. That night, Hood shortens his lines along Overton Hill, allowing him to shift troops quickly to any position needed. That night, the War Department in Washington revokes an order to remove George Thomas from command. On December 16, 1864, the temperature is 65 degrees. The Confederate position looks sound, but Hood still sends his corps commanders their routes of retreat should any disaster happen to us today. As planned, A.J. Smith's line advances to within 600 yards of the Confederate line, amidst heavy Confederate shelling. Wood and Steedman attack Overton's Hill in hopes of turning the Confederate flank. More than 1,000 Federals are killed or wounded attacking this hill. The 13th United States Colored Troops came into the action late. Other Federal units had stopped their attacks. The 13th stubbornly pushes on and pays for it. Every gun in Lee's corps hones in on them. 5 separate color bearers go down. Confederate generals even noticed the black troops' valor in action reports after the battle, a very rare occurrence. The 13th lost nearly 40% of the regiment in their first battle. By midday, the Federal attack is stalled. Hood is confident. All the Federal attacks had been handsomely repulsed. He now boldly intends to pull his troops out under cover of darkness. He wants to hit Thomas's left flank, now hanging in the air some 6 miles south of Nashville. But Wilson's cavalry will put an end to these plans. The troopers are presently around Hood's left flank and behind the Confederate army. 3 brigades of A.J. Smith's troops are positioned on the north face of Shies Hill, directly opposite the Confederate left flank. At 4:15, they storm the hillside. Hood's short lines are effective. He's handled crises all day by moving troops to hot spots, but the Federals catch him with his guard down. Hood has just pulled troops to stop Wilson's cavalry as a massive Federal bombardment begins upon his left flank. The Federal infantry were approaching one of the weakest points in the Confederate line. Bates' division, the same division who'd lost the opportunity at Spring Hill, was devastated. 1,500 were captured. 85 field, staff, and line officers gave up. The panic spread like a virus across the Confederate line. Some prisoners outnumbered their captors.
They were all ragged, dirty, and so filthy that we could smell them as plainly as if it had been a flock of sheep on a hot June day.
Thomas, watching the attack with A.J. Smith, yelled, "General, what is the matter? Are your men being captured?" "Not by a damn sight," A.J. retorts. "My men are capturing them. These are rebel prisoners, you see." Thomas, for the first time in months, begins to laugh. Hood's entire army is in full retreat. Confederate casualties are 1,500 dead and wounded, 4,500 captured. Smith's Federal Corps alone gathers 36 of the total 54 Confederate artillery pieces captured. Thomas's losses are minimal: 387 dead, 2,562 wounded, and 112 missing. The Federal veterans were overjoyed at their wonderful victory. Many veterans who fought in this action would go on to name future sons after George Thomas. Hood's army would retreat south through Tennessee, back into Alabama with Wilson's cavalry, harassing them the entire distance. On Christmas Day, 1864, Hood's Army of Tennessee again crosses the Tennessee River without 16,000 of their comrades. Many of the surviving Tennessee boys never made it that far. They simply went home after the Battle of Nashville. 2/3 of the Army of Tennessee were lost to death, wounds, desertion, or prisoners. 2/3 were lost in less than 30 days. As Hood's men left the state of Tennessee forever, Sherman's Federal Army emerged on the coast of Georgia with a 30-mile-wide swath of destruction behind them and little opposition in front of them. George Thomas loses his field command. Despite his stunning victory, government officials thought his pursuit of Hood's army sluggish. And on January 13, 1865, Friday the 13th, Hood resigns as commander of the Army of Tennessee. A few months later, Sally "Buck" Preston breaks off their engagement. The remnants of the Army of Tennessee eventually go east to rejoin their beloved former commander, Joe Johnston. On April 26, 1865, Johnston surrenders the remains of the Army of Tennessee in North Carolina, 17 days after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The American Civil War was finally over, yet the end had been in sight for more than a year, especially in the West. The continual loss of Confederate officers had sapped adequate leadership at all levels of command. The Nashville campaign had proven the Northern Army's ability throughout the latter half of the war to outgun and outman any force the Confederacy put in the field. At Franklin and at Nashville, the veterans themselves previewed the horror their grandchildren would experience during the trench warfare of World War I. That horror lingered. Not until the mid-1880s, nearly 15 years after the Civil War ended, did the veterans themselves begin to reminisce about their war. Its wounds are still healing.